The billionaire stood in the doorway of his master bedroom, watching his mistress arrange designer luggage on silk sheets, while his pregnant wife shivered outside near the doghouse in their backyard, a structure he'd actually ordered her sleep in. David Richardson had built his luxury real estate empire from a single apartment complex his mother helped him acquire 15 years ago. But tonight, he was making a decision that would cost him everything he'd spent decades building. His wife, Emma, knelt on the cold concrete patio, her 7-month pregnant belly pressing against her knees as she unfolded a thin blanket inside the doghouse. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from a secret she'd been keeping. A secret worth $3 trillion in hidden assets, offshore accounts, and a silent majority stake in the very real estate empire her husband believed he controlled. The mistress, Amber, called down from the master bedroom window, laughing as she filmed Emma's humiliation on her phone. But she didn't know that Emma had just finalized the purchase documents that transferred ownership of the Richardson family's entire real estate portfolio into her name that very afternoon. By morning, the Richardson family would wake up to foreclosure notices, frozen bank accounts, and the devastating realization that they were now homeless. Hello, welcome to African Moonlight Tales. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share it with your friends, and most important thing, turn your notification bell so you can get informed when I dropped another amazing story. Drop your thoughts and reactions in the comments. What would you do if your spouse tried to kill you and you survive? Will you take a revenge or disappear forever? Emma Richardson had learned to read the signs of her husband's infidelity 6 months ago. But the signs she'd been reading long before that were the quarterly reports from her secret investment portfolio. Reports that showed her wealth had grown from the $2 trillion her grandmother left her to nearly $3 trillion through strategic acquisitions and careful market timing. The doghouse loomed before her now, a cruel wooden structure that David had built for the German shepherd they'd owned 3 years ago, before the dog died, and before David had decided that mistresses mattered more than marriage vows. Emma's hands shook as she pulled the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders, feeling her baby kick against her ribs in protest of the cold October air. She could hear Amber's laughter floating down from the master bedroom window above, a sound that mixed with David's deeper chuckle in a harmony that would have broken Emma's heart if her heart hadn't already calcified into something harder and more calculating over the past 6 months of systematic planning. The concrete patio felt like ice against her knees. But Emma had endured worse discomforts in her 28 years. She'd endured the death of her parents in a plane crash when she was 12, the bitter custody battle with relatives who'd wanted access to her inheritance, and the careful isolation her grandmother had imposed to protect her from fortune hunters and false friends. David had seemed different when they'd met at a charity gala 7 years ago, presenting himself as a self-made real estate developer who'd built his portfolio through intelligence and hard work rather than inheritance. Emma had believed his story completely, never investigating the truth that his mother, Patricia, had actually funded his first 3 properties through money she'd inherited from her own wealthy parents. The marriage had been good for the first 4 years, filled with genuine affection and shared dreams of building a family. But everything changed when David's business partner introduced him to Amber at a real estate conference in Miami 18 months ago. Emma had noticed the late nights first, then the unexplained charges on credit cards that David thought she didn't monitor, and finally the perfume that clung to his suits, a cheap, overpowering scent that Amber apparently believed made her sophisticated, but actually announced her presence like a foghorn in a library. The discovery had hurt initially, cutting through Emma's careful emotional defenses with the precision of a surgical blade. But the pain had transformed into something more useful when she called her financial advisor and asked a simple question that changed everything. Could she, through her network of shell corporations and blind trusts, purchase the Richardson family real estate empire without anyone knowing the buyer's true identity? Her advisor had paused for exactly 3 seconds before responding with the words that launched Emma's 6-month campaign of silent acquisition and strategic revenge. Not only could she purchase the Richardson empire, but the family had made themselves vulnerable through a series of refinancing deals and leverage buyouts that left them cash-rich, but asset-poor, meaning their actual ownership of their properties was more illusion than reality. The doghouse smelled of mildew and old wood, but Emma crawled inside anyway, arranging the single blanket over newspapers she'd spread across the floor for insulation. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a message from her lead attorney confirming that the final transfer documents had been filed with the county recorder's office at 4:47 p.m. that afternoon, exactly 17 minutes before Patricia had thrown Emma's luggage onto the lawn. Emma had stood silently during her mother-in-law's tirade, watching suitcases tumble across the grass. But she'd been thinking about the legal documents that were simultaneously transferring ownership of Patricia's beloved mansion, David's office building downtown, and the entire portfolio of Richardson properties in Emma's name through a web of LLCs so complex that even forensic accountants would need months to trace the connections. The master bedroom light glowed yellow against the darkening sky. Emma could see shadows moving behind the curtains. David and Amber celebrating their night together, completely unaware that they were celebrating in a bedroom that Emma now legally owned. The memory of how David had proposed came flooding back to Emma as she lay in the doghouse, staring at the wooden ceiling just inches above her face. He'd taken her to the rooftop of his first apartment building, the one he claimed to have purchased through blood, sweat, and strategic negotiations, but which Emma's investigators had later revealed was actually bought with a $2 million loan from Patricia. The proposal had been romantic in its execution, complete with rose petals, champagne, and a speech about building an empire together. But the foundation had been constructed on lies that Emma hadn't discovered until much later, when pregnancy had made her more attentive to the discrepancies between David's public narrative and private reality. She'd loved him genuinely in those early years, believing in the partnership he'd promised and the family they'd planned to create. But love without honesty was just another transaction dressed in emotional clothing. And Emma had learned from her grandmother that transactions always came with receipts that eventually demanded payment. Patricia Richardson had never liked Emma from the moment David brought her home for Christmas dinner 6.5 years ago, making comments about Emma's plain appearance and lack of social connections that were designed to wound. The older woman had built her identity around being the matriarch of a real estate dynasty, hosting charity events and serving on museum boards, presenting herself as old money when she was actually just 2 generations removed from her own grandfather's furniture store success. Emma had threatened that carefully constructed image simply by existing as someone who didn't perform wealth the way Patricia believed wealth should be performed. Emma wore simple clothes, drove a modest car, and avoided the social climbing that Patricia considered essential to maintaining status. Her baby kicked again, harder this time, as if sensing the tension in Emma's body. Emma placed her hand on her belly, whispering promises to her unborn daughter that she would never tolerate a man who treated her the way David had treated Emma. The doghouse was small and cold and humiliating, but Emma had chosen to accept this final indignity because it would make the morning's revelations that much more devastating. Dawn arrived with cruel efficiency at 6:02 a.m., painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that mocked the darkness of Emma's accommodations. But she'd barely slept anyway, her mind too occupied with final preparations and her body too uncomfortable to achieve genuine rest. The first notification arrived on her phone at 6:15 a.m., a message from her lead attorney confirming that process servers had successfully delivered foreclosure notices to every Richardson property simultaneously, including the mansion where Emma currently shivered and the downtown office building where David kept his executive suite. Emma's fingers trembled slightly as she typed her response, authorizing the next phase, which would involve bank representatives arriving at Richardson financial offices to freeze all accounts. But her trembling came from anticipation rather than fear, from a knowledge that years of humiliation were about to transform into justice. The sound of Patricia's scream carried across the estate grounds at 6:34 a.m., a piercing shriek that shattered the morning quiet and sent birds fleeing from nearby trees. Emma could hear the older woman's voice even from inside the doghouse, shouting about mistakes and incompetence and demanding that someone explain why official-looking papers were taped to the front door of her home. The master bedroom window burst open moments later, and David's voice joined his mother's in a chorus of angry disbelief. Emma waited exactly 5 more minutes before emerging from the doghouse, giving David and Patricia time to descend into full panic mode before she made her appearance and revealed the truth they'd been too arrogant to consider possible. Her body ached from the night's confinement, and her pregnant belly made standing up more difficult than usual. But she forced herself upright and walked slowly toward the mansion's back entrance, where she could see David and Patricia standing on the terrace in their pajamas, holding foreclosure notices and shouting into phones at attorneys who apparently weren't answering their early morning calls. Amber appeared behind David and Patricia, wrapped in one of Emma's silk robes, her face confused but not yet frightened. Patricia saw Emma first, and her face contorted with rage that temporarily overrode her confusion about the foreclosure notices. Her finger pointed at Emma like a weapon as she screamed about that woman sleeping outside like the trash she is while real problems were happening inside. David turned toward Emma with an expression that mixed annoyance and dismissiveness, clearly viewing his pregnant wife as an irrelevant distraction. He made the mistake of speaking to her in the same contemptuous tone he'd been using for months, telling Emma to go back outside because adults were handling something important. But his words died in his throat when Emma smiled at him with an expression he'd never seen before, an expression of complete control mixed with patient vindication. Emma's voice came out steady and clear despite her physical exhaustion, cutting through Patricia's continued ranting with words that stopped everyone mid-breath. She informed them that Meridian Holdings, LLC, was one of 17 shell corporations she controlled through her private investment network, that she'd spent 6 months systematically purchasing every mortgage, lien, and deed associated with Richardson family properties, and that as of 4:47 p.m. the previous afternoon, she owned 100% of what they believed was their real estate empire, including the mansion they were standing in, the office building downtown, and every apartment complex and shopping center that David had claimed as his legacy. Patricia's face went white as understanding began penetrating her aristocratic delusions. David's mouth opened and closed like a fish struggling for oxygen. But Amber's reaction was the most telling. The mistress immediately began backing toward the house, recognizing that she'd attached herself to a sinking ship and already calculating her escape. Emma explained the mechanics of her acquisition with calm precision, detailing how David's aggressive refinancing strategy had created vulnerabilities that made the Richardson empire easy prey for anyone with sufficient capital. She described how each property David thought he owned was actually leveraged against multiple loans, creating a house of cards that Emma had systematically purchased piece by piece. Patricia interrupted twice, her voice shrill with desperation as she insisted this was impossible and illegal. But Emma calmly informed her mother-in-law that those same attorneys had been served with notices that morning terminating their retainer agreements due to the Richardson family's inability to pay their outstanding legal bills, which Emma had also purchased through a debt collection agency she privately owned. David's face progressed through several shades of red and purple as Emma continued speaking, his hands clenching and unclenching as he processed the magnitude of his miscalculation. He tried interrupting with accusations about fraud and deception, his voice rising to a shout as he claimed Emma had stolen his life's work. But his words collapsed in a stammering confusion when Emma produced her phone and showed him the wire transfer records proving she'd paid fair market value, actually slightly above market value, for every asset she'd acquired, making her purchases completely legal and entirely irreversible. The truth that destroyed David most thoroughly wasn't the loss of his properties, but the realization that Emma had been wealthy enough to purchase his entire empire multiple times over, that he'd spent 7 years married to a trillionaire while treating her like a dependent who should be grateful for his modest success, and that his affair with Amber had cost him access to wealth that made his $200 million portfolio look like pocket change. Amber chose that moment to reveal her true character by abandoning David with impressive speed, announcing that she didn't sign up for this drama and needed to call an Uber because she had better options than staying with a man who was apparently homeless. Patricia tried stopping the mistress from leaving, actually grabbing Amber's arm and begging her to stay. But the younger woman shook free with a disgusted expression and disappeared into the house to collect her designer luggage. Emma watched the mistress's retreat with satisfaction, noting how quickly loyalty evaporated when money disappeared, and how David's face registered the double betrayal of losing both his empire and his affair partner within the span of 10 minutes. The final phase of Emma's revelation came when she informed David and Patricia that they had 72 hours to vacate the mansion and all other Richardson properties, that their bank accounts would remain frozen pending investigation into several fraudulent loan applications Emma's team had discovered, and that the luxury cars in the garage, the artwork on the walls, and even the furniture they believed they owned were actually purchased through loans secured against properties that Emma now controlled, making everything subject to immediate repossession. Patricia collapsed onto a terrace chair, her aristocratic composure finally shattering as she realized she would be homeless within 3 days. But David remained standing, his eyes fixed on Emma with an expression that mixed horror, disbelief, scorn, and the dawning recognition that he'd destroyed his own life through arrogance and cruelty. Emma felt her baby kick as if celebrating their victory, and she placed her hand on her belly while delivering her final statement to the man who'd forced her to sleep in a doghouse while giving their bedroom to his mistress. She told David that she'd actually loved him once, genuinely and completely, but that love required respect to survive, and respect was something he'd abandoned the moment he'd chosen Amber over his marriage vows. Emma explained that the doghouse experience hadn't created her desire for revenge that had been building for months, but it had confirmed that her plan was justice rather than cruelty. Because a man who would force his 7-month pregnant wife to sleep outside like an animal didn't deserve the empire he'd inherited or the wealth he'd never actually earned. Patricia tried one final time to appeal to Emma's mercy, invoking their shared history and the grandchild Emma carried. But Emma reminded her mother-in-law that Patricia herself had thrown Emma's luggage onto the lawn while screaming that she didn't deserve to live under their roof, making it poetically appropriate that Patricia would now experience exactly what she'd wished upon Emma. Emma walked away from the terrace at 7:23 a.m., leaving David and Patricia standing among their foreclosure notices while moving trucks arrived to begin repossessing their possessions. As she climbed into the car waiting at the front gate, she felt her baby kick one final time, as if acknowledging that sometimes the only way to teach people about respect is to show them what life looks like without the power they'd abused for far too long. 3 years had passed since the morning David Richardson discovered that his pregnant wife owned everything he believed was his legacy. Emma stood in the nursery of her penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, watching her daughter Sophia play with building blocks on a custom rug that cost more than David's first investment property. Sophia had her father's dark hair and her mother's calculating eyes, a combination that suggested she would grow into someone formidable. But Emma was determined that her daughter would learn to wield power with compassion rather than cruelty, to understand that strength didn't require humiliating those who were vulnerable. The Richardson family had scattered like leaves after a hurricane. David had moved to a studio apartment in Queens, working as a property manager for a corporate real estate firm that paid him $60,000 annually, a salary that would have seemed generous to most people, but felt like poverty to a man who'd once believed he controlled a $200 million empire. Emma's investigators reported that he'd aged dramatically over the past 3 years, his hair graying prematurely and his posture reflecting the weight of mistakes that couldn't be undone. David had attempted communication 17 times in the first year, sending letters that progressed from angry accusations to desperate pleas to finally settling into hollow apologies that acknowledged his failures without truly comprehending the depth of his betrayal. Patricia Richardson had experienced perhaps the most complete reversal of fortune, moving from her 30-room mansion to a subsidized senior living facility in New Jersey. Emma had ultimately established a small trust fund that provided Patricia with basic necessities while denying her any luxuries, strategic rather than merciful, ensuring Patricia would witness how the family empire had been transferred to the granddaughter she'd never respected. Amber had predictably moved on to her next wealthy target within weeks, attaching herself to a technology entrepreneur in San Francisco, who was currently under investigation for securities fraud. Emma had ensured that Amber's role in the Richardson family destruction followed her through carefully placed information in social circles where mistresses were still judged harshly. The Richardson real estate empire had been restructured under Emma's ownership into something more ethical and substantially more profitable. Emma implemented fair housing practices, reasonable rent increases, and tenant protections that her business managers had initially resisted as leaving money on the table, but which had ultimately generated better long-term returns through reduced vacancies and improved property values. She discovered that treating people with dignity, even when they couldn't fight back, created loyalty and stability that aggressive profit maximization could never achieve. The portfolio that David had managed to squeeze $200 million from was now worth over $800 million under Emma's stewardship, proving that compassion and capitalism weren't mutually exclusive. Emma had kept 3 properties from the original Richardson portfolio as reminders of where she'd come from and what she'd survived, but she'd sold or donated the rest to focus on new acquisitions. The doghouse had been demolished within a week of Emma's revelation, reduced to splinters and burned in a small ceremony that Emma had conducted alone. She'd saved one piece of the wood, a small plank with her daughter's newborn handprint pressed into white paint as a reminder that even the darkest moments could contain the seeds of transformation. The plank hung in her office now, mounted in an expensive frame that deliberately contrasted with the cheap wood's humble origins. David had requested visitation rights with Sophia through his court-appointed attorney. Emma had agreed to supervised visits at a neutral location once monthly, not because she'd forgiven David, but because she wanted Sophia to form her own opinions about her father rather than simply inheriting Emma's justified anger. The mansion itself had been partially converted into a nonprofit residential facility for pregnant women escaping domestic violence, with Emma funding the operation through her charitable foundation and occasionally visiting to share her own story with residents who needed to understand that circumstances could change if you were strategic enough and patient enough to wait for your moment. Sophia looked up from her blocks and smiled at her mother with the unself-conscious joy of a 3-year-old who didn't yet understand that her family history contained betrayal, revenge, and the systematic destruction of her father's legacy. But Emma knew that someday she would need to explain everything to her daughter in age-appropriate increments that balanced honesty with protection. Emma had gained everything she'd set out to achieve: financial security for her daughter, consequences for those who'd abused her, and proof that underestimating quiet people was a mistake that destroyed empires. But she'd also lost the innocent belief that love could survive anything, and that marriage vows meant something beyond temporary promises that evaporated under pressure. Patricia had written Emma a letter 6 months ago, the first communication between them since the morning of the foreclosure notices. The letter had contained no genuine apology, just circular reasoning about how Emma should have understood that Patricia was protecting her son. But there was a paragraph near the end that had caught Emma's attention. Patricia had written that she sometimes dreamed about the day she'd thrown Emma's luggage onto the lawn, except in the dreams, it was Patricia's own belongings scattering across the grass while Emma watched from the terrace. Emma had filed the letter without responding, deciding that Patricia's fragmentary self-awareness wasn't sufficient to warrant reconciliation, but was enough to suggest that even the most self-deluded people occasionally glimpse the truth about their character. The sun was setting over Central Park, painting the sky in shades that reminded Emma of the dawn when she'd emerged from the doghouse to reveal the truth that had crushed David's world. 3 years of distance had transformed her anger into something closer to sad acceptance that some people never learned until the consequences destroyed them completely. Emma held her daughter close as the sunset deepened into twilight, thinking about beginnings and endings and the eternal cycle of consequences. She made a silent promise to Sophia that whatever else happened in their lives, her daughter would never spend a single night wondering if her mother valued her dignity, her safety, or her fundamental worth as a human being deserving of respect. The doghouse was gone, burned to ash and memory, but its lesson remained carved into Emma's understanding of human nature and power dynamics. That cruelty always generated mathematics that eventually balanced through loss. That underestimating quiet people destroyed empires. And that forcing your pregnant wife to sleep outside while you gave a master bedroom to your mistress was the kind of mistake that crushed everything you'd built and left you homeless in ways that transcended merely lacking shelter, making you a refugee from your own character flaws with nowhere left to hide from the consequences you'd authored through arrogance, betrayal, and catastrophic miscalculation. The end. What an incredible journey. If this story moved you, give a big thumbs up. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of karma, justice, and redemption. Hit that bell so you never miss our next upload. Comment below.